Well, hello and welcome. Thanks for coming along on this beautiful day and taking the time to come indoors for this latest instalment, I suppose, in the Contemplation Conversation series. Today's event is called Mindful Traditions Exploring Mental Health Through Contemplative Practices, and it's hosted by the Contemplative Studies Centre here at the University of Melbourne. I'm Paul Barclay, broadcaster and journalist, and it's a terrific pleasure to be here. I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people who are the traditional custodians of the land we are on, and I would also like to pay my respect to elders past and present of the Kulin Nation and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians present today. Before we commence, just some brief housekeeping. We are recording this event, so I suppose if any of you want to kind of keep yourself off camera, you could, I don't know, hide in the corner up there behind the camera. The bathrooms are to my left, and we will have some audience questions at the end of this conversation. So just have a think as we're going through about some questions or matters you'd like to bring up at the end. I'm sure we'd love to hear your thoughts. We regret to say that Reverend Dr. Gary Deverell has had to withdraw from today's event. Now, given the timing and the current challenges faced by Indigenous communities in Australia at the moment, we would just like to express our wholehearted solidarity with First Nations people at the minute. We are joined by a wonderful panel of speakers today, and let me introduce them to you. On my left is Jess Hewen, a meditation teacher in the Insight tradition. Jess has trained in traditional Buddhist monastic settings, in interfaith contexts of meditative inquiry, and also within long periods of solitary forest practice. While deeply informed but not bound by tradition, her style is very much grounded in contemporary life. Next to Jess, we have Sarah Sabah, founding director and president of Benevolence Australia. Sarah has been active in the field of youth and community work in Melbourne for over 25 years, and Benevolence is a grassroots community organisation that sees itself as part of the global scholarly and spiritual revival, aiming to reclaim the narrative on Islam, which I think is particularly important at the moment, and conscious ethical living in the modern world. Welcome to Sarah. And on the end of the panel, I said I was just going to introduce you just as Sunam, but perhaps I should give you your full title of Venerable Bonhayon Sunam. I hope I've got that right. Did I bugger that up?
I think that's pretty good. It's close enough.
Okay. Sunam is a chaplain.
That's why I say just call me Sunam.
Yes. A chaplain and doctoral research candidate at Western Sydney University, a past chair of the Australian Sangha Association and Buddhist member of the Religious Advisory Committee to the Australian Defence Forces, and has long been active in chaplaincy and spiritual care, having managed the prison chaplaincy program and established the spiritual pastoral care program for the Buddhist Council of Australia. Please make our speakers welcome. Now, I thought it would be good to start off with, to get a sense of your individual stories. So I'll come to you first of all, Jess. Your personal journey, if you like, within your contemplation tradition, how that's influenced perhaps your understanding of mental well-being, or something like that.
Yes, I'll run with it. Well, it was interesting because we just had a panel this morning and started to talk about this, but it definitely began with some grit and some vulnerability. And like many teenagers, a kind of metamorphic crisis where I started asking a lot of questions. And I do think the driving question was, as I was quite wild in my youth, explorative, and the driving question was, how can we actually be with suffering and our inevitable pain as a human being in a wise way? And what I was seeing around me at the time, like a lot of addiction, and I was seeing friends with through the addictions and drug use and different things, mental health issues, and and confronted at that time, like feeling there was a different way to live that wasn't leaping over suffering. Yeah, and at that time too, like, because I'd been in a lot of different situations and had been in very terrifying situations where I'd been confronted with suffering in a pretty extreme way that had shocked me. It was a very strong question for my own mind too, that there's something deeper in the mind than what's just presenting in this moment. That there is a deeper reference point for my being that isn't just in the mind and in thinking. And that was part of what sort of led me through. Yeah.
Suffering is such a loaded word too, isn't it? It has a lot of meanings. But you're, I think, talking about a kind of existential suffering, a kind of a suffering that's specifically related to how you were living, or how... Do you want to just give a bit more context to how you were using that term?
Yes. Well, I think, like, also friends like saying drug addiction. Yeah. And using that term of people will mean experiencing feelings and not knowing how to the support to meet them wisely. Yeah. Yeah, essentially. And also normalising levels of, like, some suffering's just normal, but growing a certain robustness to meet our experience. And so I was just feeling, there was a lot of friends who just wanted to keep having fun, keep going with it, just keep it all moving, keep it all great. And, you know, my parents were breaking up, and so I was seeing, like, this rift there, and so it was just this, Yeah.
I think a lot of people can relate to that, and how does one process, deal with that, move forward. Sarah, how would you describe your personal journey to where you are and how you see things?
Yeah, so probably similar to what Jess was saying is that, I mean, in the Buddhist tradition you use the term suffering. In the Islamic tradition we use the term tribulation. And so mine started at the age of 14 when I began my spiritual path, when my mother passed away. And that was a lot of pain, obviously. And I came from a single household. My mum raised us. I was one of the youngest of 5 children. And so her passing and watching her going through the pain and being by her bedside the entire 3 months before passing away and then passing forced me to ask those big questions in life at a very young age, where usually you don't usually ask those questions. And the questions were, where did my mother go? What is life about? Is there life after death? The big questions. And although I was not brought up in a Muslim household, in terms of a practicing Muslim household, I knew Islam. And so for me, it was literally on the day of her funeral that I held on to God. And I began my spiritual practices on that day. And if we're talking about mental health, this is the late 80s, we didn't have language for it back then. But for me, what spirituality, what my practices did, is it created that zone where I was held. So I didn't have a time to even think about the anxiety and the stress and the pain of what I was going through, or the suffering that I was going through, because my practices really held me ever so gently. And since then I've had a really positive experience with them and maintained them since.
So it was bereavement coupled with a kind of curiosity that had pre-existed?
No, it did not pre-exist.
Right.
The curiosity I was 14 at the time, so there was nothing I was interested in with regards to faith or spirituality, or I was doing what any young girl was doing, music, fashion, all of that, school. It's the pain that threw me into this curiosity, because other than that, it would have taken me into an abyss of absolute confusion and pain and suffering. And it was almost, I chose to not take that path. And I don't know if I chose it. I'm a woman of faith. I believe God took me out of it. And so that's the path that led me into the practices and spirituality.
And Sanim? Some food for thought.
I mean, we've already had that opportunity to kind of hear each other. And I think the commonality for us is that there was a prime split, really, And, you know, for me, I was a very spiritual child. I was born in the early 50s, and, you know, it was a time where, you know, no one talked about anything of spirit or heart, or, you know, it was but I was a very spiritual child, and of course at that time Christianity was the only visible faith tradition in Australian society. You know, so I went along to church and Sunday school, and look, of my siblings, I was the one who wanted to keep going. They reached a certain age and my parents said, okay, you don't need to go anymore. But it did, you know, it fed something in me. But I guess, you know, I was actually, you know, I'm not really said this publicly, but I was sexually abused by a relative when I was, you know, nearly 11 years old. And you know, my mother came, you know, to pick me up, and she came to the door and she said to me, well, we won't talk about this, will we? And, you know, so I suppose what happened for me, it was, I just buried it. But you know, within a year, I started to unravel in all sorts of ways. But I didn't understand it. I had no idea that had any influence. I lost my trust at that point. I was a very trusting, you know, that was my natural, but my trust was broken, and I spiraled out of control, crazy, you know, like Jess, rebel, and, you know, ended up spiraling into the mental health system, and that, you know, that didn't, you know, that was just another form of punishment and banishment, and yeah, so it was a really torrid time where I had really no idea what was going on. I just knew that I was hurting very deeply, and that no one was interested to try to help me understand it. And you know, I had this tough exterior. People would say to me, "Oh, you're so strong," but of course, you know, I was deeply crying, and, you know, really deeply helpless inside. And so, you know, I guess I you know, I managed to get through school, and there was always at least one person where I was at times like that in my life, who would just see something else in me and would help me to, you know, to kind of stay afloat. And you know, so I you know, like Jess, you know, I you know, used drugs for a while, and, you know, I just did those things that are very common for people who've experienced, you know, a degree of break of trust. And then I was saying to the people this morning, you know, the students this morning, that you know, I was in a well, in fact, you know, this was a couple of years later. So I was around in the time of the women's movement, and, you know, setting up the women's refuges, and, you know, taking to the streets and all that sort of stuff, you know. But I was working in a refuge. It was early days of the refuge movement. And without going to a long story, I mean, there were two women staying there, and they both had teenage girls, 15 years old. And, you know, they went to stay a night in, you know, a friend of mine, her flat, or her unit, we call now, was underneath where I was living. And so this friend went away and said, look, let them have that space. And anyway, cut a long story short, they were drinking and doing all sorts of stuff, and one of them stabbed to death the other one. And it was, you know, I mean, I was just catatonic, actually. I just, you know, but, you know, I managed to sort of say to the rest of the, you know, the collective that I was working with at the refuge, we really need to talk about this. We really need to, you know, unpack it a bit. And no one wanted to talk about it. And so I ended up back in you know, a psychiatric centre, and a friend of mine said, look, why don't you try something else? It's not working for you. And so I went to stay in a yoga ashram. Some of you may know Satchidananda Yoga, that was just been really just new in Australia at that point, and they were building the ashram up in Mangrove Mountain in New South Wales. And I went there really broken and, you know, just no capacity for anything. And I stayed there. You know, I as I said this morning, I sat by the river and just sobbed for a couple of weeks, and then, you know, was assigned to this activity of making mud bricks to build the huts for little houses for people. And it was actually in the mud pool that I woke up. It's very strange. Like, you know, in making mud bricks, you have this big pool of water and mud, and you get in with bare feet and you just stomp to try and make a consistency, you know. And people are putting straw and stuff in, you know, that's a mixture. And it was so liberating. It was like all of this stuff, you know, all of this, you know, kind of out of body, fear, pain, hurt, all this sort of stuff. It just landed. And, you know, and I was, you know, I was grounded. And so, you know, that was really the beginning. And I stayed with a community for a while, and I learnt to meditate, and I did yoga. And really, for the rest of, you know, 50 plus years since then, that's been my life. You know, in one way or another, that's been a go-to for me. And yeah, so that's my story.
Amazing story. Perhaps I think there's two themes coming through here. One about spirituality, being a spiritual person, that term spirituality and spiritual, and also the contemplative practice that is often a part of that. Just tell us a bit about how you might understand that term spiritual and spirituality yourself, and the types of contemplative practice that you engage with, and how it connects with your notion of spirituality.
Okay, yes. I was thinking about that because I could answer that in so many different ways.
Yeah,
but one
it's
way
a big question too.
No, but I would say one way, some kind of method or a practice that you can get behind that's aligned with your deeper values, you know, because we can all say, I'm in this body, don't know how long. When you really let that land, it does make sense to love. It does make sense to give your deepest presence to each other, to yourself. It makes sense. I would like to settle into my body and my life while I'm here. Like that's the grounding context or the leveling context, you know. So there's that. And we can have moments of revelation around that. We might all have that. It's like, oh yes, life is so important, you know, and transient. That now gets played to aeroplane music and watered down, and we almost like get bored. But how do we stay on our toes with that? And I think a practice for me is a method that allows us to keep clearing away the dross, just to stay awake and alert, maybe even some innocence of attention, to look at things freshly. And that takes some discipline in the service of that kind of alertness. So in the Buddha Dharma tradition, where I was trained, you could break it down very simply to sort of three main orientations. First, you've got a kind of ethical orientation. It's like, well, I don't live in a silo. My practice isn't just on the mountaintop. What I do, what I say, what I speak, how I move impacts the space around me. I'm a relational being. So there is a cleaning up of ethics, you know, but again, not in the Dharma. It's not like a moral ethic on top. It's like through getting more sensitive, you kind of feel, well, if I do that, that's going to really impact someone. You know, it's an internal compass that you grow through practice. So there's that kind of ground, you know, that the intention behind practice isn't just so I can get more efficient to earn more money and be a better business person or something. There is actually a heart relationship to what I'm doing.
It's not transactional.
It's not transactional. I'm willing to feel life deeper than the transaction. And then you'll have a whole lot of practices that help you, and probably we all have them in our traditions, to settle the mind. So like as a teenager, I was like, oh my God, if my mind's like this for the rest of my life, I don't want to be here, you know? I do not want to be in my own head. But then I was like, no, I started to think, no, actually, there's these techniques that help us settle down, that help us get a broader perspective, which is beautiful when we feel that. We're not just slammed up against our thoughts. There's some space to see, because some of our thoughts are trustworthy and some of them clearly aren't, you know? Some of them are moved by fear, some of them moved by ease, some of them are moved by worry. Anyway, that, and then, so you'll have the ethics, then you have the grounding practices, we call the serenity practices, just to start to see, and then the wisdom practices, the insight practices, ways of seeing, ways of being with our experience that elicit a certain response. And in my tradition, any way that sees, that liberates suffering, that loosens things up, that brings more ease to the being, is an insight. And that's like, you know, like you could say, you know, sometimes we just can't see things, and then you get the steadiness, then you can see what's in your field, and then you know how to work with it. We kind of know what we need to know what our suffering is before we can actually then wisely respond to it.
Yeah.
Okay. That's as pithy as I can be.
Yeah. I mean, I think, Sarah, you gave us I suppose in a way, a more thorough explanation of your spiritual background in Islam. So for you, the idea of a higher power is contributing to your contemplative practice. Give us an idea, though, about how it, in turn, contributes to your emotional well-being.
So it's a good question. So in Islam, we don't necessarily differentiate between, so we're talking about mental health, but what we're really talking about when I refer to mental health, we're talking about the entire body. Mind, body, spirit, emotions, the entire being. We can't just do practices for our mental health or do things just for our mental health. We're talking about our emotional, social well-being. We're talking about the entire person. And so, you know, asking what is the spirit, and we live in an age, and I think you were saying that in a previous session, people don't want to identify with religion because it comes with a lot of baggage, but everybody is really happy to take on the word spiritual. I'm spiritual, I'm not religious. If we really unpack that, I'd be interested, what does that mean? Because everybody has a different understanding. I'm spiritual but not religious. There's a real fear of the term religious. And, you know, granted for various reasons. From an Islamic Muslim practice, the soul, the spirit, is considered to be from the unknown, it's from God. And so the practices that what we're trying to do is that we know we have a physical body, we know we have a mind, and we know we have a body, mind, and spirit. And what we're trying to do with our practices is ensure that we're taking care of all those three areas simultaneously. And hence we have a physical law, but that physical law is to ensure that the spiritual and the emotional are taken care of, not just the practices, but however what my practices do, such as my 5 daily prayer, which is an obvious one. Any Muslim will tell you that the first thing that they will learn, even at the age of 7. So we teach children as young as 7, which is interesting because, you know, meditation and contemplative practices are usually taught later on. But I was in Bhutan a few years ago, and it was phenomenal to see that, you know, Bhutan is a Buddhist tradition where children at school are learning, you know, meditation. And so in Islam, by the age of 7, children are taught how to meditate, taught how to practice the salat, which is the 5 daily disciplined prayers. To your question, precisely, to refer to your question, how does that cultivate or take care of my emotional needs? The idea is that I am, first of all, know what I'm doing here. Like the big questions in life, I know what I'm doing here. I know who I am. I know what body I'm in. I know my purpose. I know my goal. I know my orientation. Right? That's grounding.
Yeah.
I know my orientation. I know what's going to happen to me after I exit this world. I'm not confused about anything. Okay, now let's get to work. Let's cultivate my purpose. And so the 5 daily prayers, practices very much keep me in line. And so they center me and they allow me to put things in balance. And that's how, I guess, just in a brief, the 5 daily prayers are the most important ones that will align me.
I mean, that's pretty I think people would be enviable of, I don't know whether this is the right word, but the certainty with which, the clarity with which you live your life. And I would hazard to guess that a lot of the emotional disruption, anxiety, stress, whatever, people suffer in various ways is accompanied by a lack of clarity, not just spiritual clarity, just clarity of direction.
Absolutely.
And so on. And so I suppose what people who are perhaps not as religious as you are might be looking for is there's all these techniques that people are practicing at the moment to clear the mind, go for a walk in nature or disconnect from technology or, I don't know, breathing exercises, yoga and so on. I want to get a sense from all of you about, can we take from your spiritual background some of the techniques that have been so effective at working for you and apply them more generally to a community that's in need of the replenishment or whatever that it provides? And Sonam, is it that simple?
Look, I'm listening to conversation. I think just referring back to something that Sarah was saying, I think, and there's a little book I found in the airport in Sydney. Some of you have probably seen this. It's Ikigai. And it's an extraordinary little book. I'd never seen it before. Thanks, Sydney Airport. And it talks about Ikigai is like, find your purpose. What is your purpose? What is your beingness? And one of the kind of principles that this is a Japanese a wisdom teaching, and it took root in Okinawa. Okinawa is an island, very northern part of Japan, and it's actually the place where the last battle of the Second World War took place, and there were over 200,000 people who were killed in that battle. But the Okinawans have the longest longevity in the world. Now, I'm not promoting longevity as the one thing we need to. In fact, in the Western countries, we're trying to look at how we can end it sooner. But it speaks to not about their focus on the longevity. It speaks to how they live their life, moment to moment, day to day. And one of the principles, or one of the things that they live by is, treat everyone as a sister or brother, whether you've ever met them before or not. And, this is such an important thing in our world now, isn't it? We're so polarised. We see that, with the outbreak of war and in Palestine and Israel, in Ukraine, and all these places. And, it is a lack of trust in ourselves, really. When we trust ourselves, we don't fear others in the same way. And I think you're saying that, Sarah, when you're sitting in yourself in a way, and you're comfortable in yourself, then, you can meet the world from there, and it doesn't look so scary. And I think, the thing with we talk now about meditation practice, meditation techniques, mindfulness, practice mindfulness. They're all these things, they're techniques, they're practices. Yeah. We take it on for 5 minutes for, whatever. But in fact, the Buddha was a mental health guru, I have to tell you. What he brought into the world, was a really a curative for the troubles and trials of human existence. And meditation, contemplation, whatever you want to call it, mindfulness, it's not so much about doing. We're always talking about doing meditation, doing contemplation. It's about, just being. And in fact, in the Buddhist path, we talk more about you do until you get the wisdom, not to do. And at that point, the meditation kicks in for you. So it's kind of coming to that place where we have to undo, just let it fall away from us, all of the, the craziness and the, you know, the sort of misunderstandings and all that, and all the stuff we attach to about I and me and, you know, enemy and friend and all this sort of stuff. When we get past that, you know, meditation just does itself. You know, you don't have to do it. And I'm not saying you don't have to do it in the beginning. You know, like, you know, I had to do it for a long time, and you feel like you have to do it. But wow, having the wisdom of hindsight, it would have been great if I'd been able to see from the beginning, like, you know, we don't have to keep pushing, you know, to practice this technique or practice that. Contemplation is natural to human beings. We are contemplative beings. We are spiritual beings. Essentially, that's our nature. You know, and we keep kind of, you know, we say in the tradition that I belong to, the Zen tradition, we talk about painting legs on snakes, which is saying, you know, the snake is fine as it is. You know, you don't need to paint legs on it's all right. And that sort of thing, we just, you know, if we could just be with ourselves, you know. And that's not always easy because there's so, you know, I can tell you from as you've heard a little bit, you know, I didn't want to be with myself. I couldn't, you know, the last place I wanted to be was, you know, really in touch with myself because it was too painful. And it's a really painful world, you know, it's not a kind world. So, you know, but I think the simple things of you know, of how we might approach a practice, the things of, you know, learning to breathe consciously, you know, to be with the breath, to take the breath deep into our body, you know, and to, you know, kind of let the mind just be, not keep grasping all the time, pushing away what we don't want and pulling towards us what we do. You know, and this very simple technique I talked about this morning is just, you know, when you don't have to sit on a cushion and, you know, whatever, you know, when you feel stress, distress, just stop. Just stop. You know, 5-10 minutes, you know, find a little space wherever you are. It's almost always possible to do that. And just breathe deeply. Take 10 deep breaths and then take your awareness down to this point just below the navel. We call the Tantian or the Tangian point. And just you know, anchor your attention on that point. And don't change the breathing, just allow the breath to be normal. Just watch as the belly contracts and falls with each in-out breath. Simple as that, you know, and every time your mind strays, it'll stray 1,000 times in a minute, you know, it'll go back to the, you know, the thinking, the mad sort of tapes that are going around your head. It'll attach to the emotional stuff that's arising. Again, just take yourself back, you know, 1,000 times in a minute if you need to do that.
So that's a great example of a useful technique, if you like.
Yes, that's right. That is a technique.
But what you've all spoken of is something a lot more holistic than that.
That's right.
And so I'm interested then in those 2 points, really. Because...
Well, can I just say that it's actually returning us to ourselves. You know, that's essentially what these sorts
That's true, but I suppose what I'm alluding to is the fact that you've all made certain choices, not just about the contemplative practice that you're engaging in, but how you live your life holistically. And I'm just wondering whether you know, modern life is crazy. We are living insane lives, and I say that as someone who's just come off the back of a 40-plus year career as a journalist, deadlines, madness, all of that. And I think I'm only now realising, having the freedom of no longer being stuck in that world, of how bonkers it was, Absolutely. How stressful it was. But so many people are stuck in that world. They've got to pay the bills, they've got to afford the housing, they've got to pay off the HECS debt, they're kind of... But what they also want is the benefit of your wisdom, the suggestions of the technique. I suppose my question here is, Are too many people just looking for a quick fix? Do you think?
Yeah. Yes.
Bit of Dorothy Dixon, isn't it, that question?
Point. That was my first point. Yes, I think we want things really quick, and I think we want answers bottled quickly. And I think there is something, like in a meditation practice, it can sort of sound a bit wanky, I don't know, but we're exploring something that we may have never experienced before that's part of our human experience. So quickly we limit what we can experience or perceive. But in a meditation practice, we are, like, well, first it just takes time. Like when we're stressed, stress feeds stress. Like if when I'm more stressed, that's when I want a coffee, that's when it speeds up, and then I'm like, ugh.
Yep.
It's like to cut that cycle, to get disenchanted with living under that kind of stress, you have to have some chutzpah, you have to have some energy to say, no, I want a deeper experience of life. You know, I don't just want to be, I want to feel my existence while I'm here. And then like any pursuit, if it's an art pursuit or a journalistic career, you have to work. I don't have any problem with that.
Yeah.
It's like, it's okay to want something and to go for it. And sometimes in the spiritual traditions, there's a little bit like, oh, no, here we're all just easy and we just allow, and which is an essential part of it, like learning to not be frightened of suffering, to soften where you want to tighten. There's all these deep things, but it's also okay to like get behind something and kind of go for it. Because I think we're in a crisis. We're in a health crisis.
Yeah.
And something needs to change. Like, I'm thinking, Bayo Akamalafe, he's a beautiful Nigerian philosopher. The times are urgent, so let us slow down.
Yeah.
We're not saying everything's, a contemplative practice is in full awareness that there is deep suffering, there's inequities, there's all of this, and still finding a deeper ground to respond to all of this, to have more creativity, more movability, less fixation, takes some application.
Yeah. So, Sarah, is the change about individual change first, and that as each individual changes, the society changes, or is it about us collectively changing society so that some of these stresses dissipate?
Can we do both?
Yeah, can we do both? Yeah.
It's just a very Western thing, with all due respect, to say, you know, as you were asking before, can we just have a bit of your tools and that we can take? Because essentially, Western practice of meditation has been taken from Buddhism, from Hinduism, right?
Yeah.
From other traditions. Interesting, it hasn't come to Islam, which is very fascinating, because we can't talk about the practices within Islam. Islam is a way of life. Every aspect of it, and I was saying to the previous group, is an act of worship, is an act of meditation and contemplation. Before coming into this session, I was meditating and doing my noontime prayers. Right, before coming in this morning, I was up at 4 a.m. and I liked what you said, Jess, about you need to do some effort. And in the West, we don't necessarily like that kind of effort. We expect things to flow. We have this image of meditation that you just let things be. Waking up at 4 a.m. wasn't letting it be. I could have easily turned my alarm off and just go back to sleep. But no, this is something that I do. And it doesn't become, after many years, it no longer becomes a challenge. So you need to, turn that up a little bit more, like any type of workout. And your question, do we do individual work or collective work? In the Quran, God says God will not change a people until they change what is in themselves. So if we don't like what's happening in society, and if we don't like our leadership, leaders had to come from somewhere. They came from our community, right? And if we don't like what's happening in society, we need to look at ourselves first. But no, we don't want to do that. The whole look at yourself, it's incredibly difficult. But if we did the work on ourselves first, and then on our family units, and then our communities, that's going to extend. And everyone's practice and everyone's mindfulness in their own ways is going to impact the other person. We have a belief in our tradition that what I am doing here is going to impact the community in China. What people in China are doing are impacting Portugal. What people in Portugal are doing are impacting Spain. Why? Because we are one community. Before this whole we are a global community conversation started happening, we are all impacting energetically each other. So when you take care of yourself, you're actually taking care of me. When I take care of me, I'm taking care of you, right? Because if I bump into you somewhere, I've tamed my inner ego, and you're not going to get the worst out of me. You're going to get the best out of me. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's two ways.
I feel like we talk a lot about emotional well-being and mental health in today's society generally, and there's a lot of professional, say, clinical practice devoted to it. There's a lot of university courses devoted to it. I wonder how much of the type of wisdom that the three of you have imparted from your different faith traditions today has found its way into mainstream health around mental health. Are we seeing some of this thinking influencing mental health practice at a public health level, Sunim?
I think it's essential that we work at that level. I think, the truth is that the number or the percentage of people in the world today who seriously take a path of meditation and stick with it and continue, hasn't changed. The percentage hasn't changed. So if we're on a mission to try and train you all in meditation into a lifelong path, it's not going to happen. So right now, we really have to look at how we can take the essence of our practices and use them in a way of giving people 5-minute fixes. I honestly, I've had a lot of resistance about that, but I don't honestly see that there's we can talk about, encouraging people to take the path and, really develop a practice. And some will, of course, and that's wonderful. But it's how we can use the wisdom in our individual faith practices to, and one of the things is, to help people just to stop for a minute, just stop, and kind of turn inside and go, what's going on? What's happening? And because, people are running around constantly, like, in the university where I am, it's like, they're all, I want meditation, I want, but then you offer meditation and only one person turns up, or, it's just like, excuse me, there's no point in getting frustrated about it, and, it's like, what is it that we can offer? And, I've been doing, because my research is really around this whole area, and at the university where I am, and I've had some amazing 1 to 2 hour in-depth interviews with students in the 18 to 34-year-old bracket, and they are deep thinkers. They're beautiful people, and they talk about their spiritual beings. That's the spiritual is really, really important to them. They're not interested in organised religion, but they identify as spiritual beings. They're interested in learning about the wisdom teachings. They're interested in ritual, and they talk so deeply with me. I just am so, grateful for their trust in that. So I know that they're not, what's the word, flibbity-gibbets. Some of you older people like that expression from My Fair Lady, was it, or something? But it's, there is how do we help them to use what's inside them already, to meet that stress and tension and fear and anxiety.
That they are feeling, particularly as a group, as a cohort of people growing up in a world of grave uncertainty. You're an 18-year-old at university. How are you going to afford a place to live? How are you going to cope with climate change? You're seeing none of the kind of lessons that have been learnt of history about how to solve global conflicts coming at them all of the time. And as you say, Sanim, one of the most thoughtful generations that we've created as a society, deep thinkers, and not surprisingly afflicted by emotional distress. And this is a great challenge, isn't it, Jess? I mean, how we use some of these contemplative practices, techniques and so on to assist a generation that...
And can I just say...
Anyway, sorry.
No, that's
fine. And then maybe you can follow Jess.
I just wanted to make reference to two of our Navy friends who are here, who are chaplains in defence. And you know, the way of practice with people is to meet them where they're at. You know, that's the you don't go in saying, I can teach you this and I can help you to do that. You go in and you help them just to explore what's inside them. What is it, that's the issue you want to address. What are the strengths and you help them to bring out their own inner resources, their own, kind of solutions, and I think that's where we have to go with these people. It's, there's no stick-on fix-its, they're deeper than that. It's not going to work.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Jess, any thoughts on that?
I think that young people that we do need, like an empowerment to stay resourced in these times is a big ask. But I think that these practices really do help. And I think part of the contemplative studies and getting it more vocal, that there are really mapped out. I mean, the Buddha's maps were so intricate in terms of an internal landscapes. I mean, he had some fire-out experiences. I mean, there is mystery in what he was exploring. Yeah. Yet he was very rational. He was almost like a man of modernity in how he actually articulated it. So you have maps about everything that you will come against in your own mind when you get quiet. And the more that we have more, I think as well, that we can get more robust. We need to get more robust and more resourced to handle more complexity and to handle more intensity of feelings. There's going to be more climate devastation. There's going to be more times where we're like now, with what's happening right now politically, where we're all it's pretty easy to feel overwhelmed.
It is.
And distressed. Yet that doesn't help. We think if we stay worried, if we stay wound up, we're really on it. But there is actually another way where we can actually rest into our being and regenerate at the same time that we have our eyes open. So I keep looking at you more than everyone. But that we can do this. It's we can actually handle a lot of intensity if we have the tools to be with it. But we're not such an emotionally mature culture to handle death well, to handle grief well. There's going to be times in our life where we don't look great. That's all right. We want it all to be neat and perfect and presentable, but it's unruly. To me, that's okay. The gold will come from that. So I wonder, Sarah, too, about this fast-paced, technology-driven world that we're in, where there's rarely silence. Right? You go for a walk and you whack the headphones on, squeeze another podcast in, or whatever, and there's no time for just no, I'm going to go for a walk. And how do we maintain, given those pressures, the kind of consistent, contemplative practice over time that we've heard will deliver benefits? Any advice about how to combat digital distractions and information overload and all of that?
So I can only talk from my experience. I don't practice, meditation outside of a faith, backdrop. And for me, purpose is incredibly important. We go back to that. Purpose, the whys. Even if we're going to give tools to people that don't have a practice, there's going to be a why. Why am I doing it? How am I doing it? And from which tradition am I doing it? And the why is incredibly important. What's the intention that I'm going to bring into it? So in terms of the distractions that we live in, the kind of fast-paced life that we live at the moment, once again, this is a Western phenomena. I come from a traditional tradition. I'm originally from Syria. Obviously, I've lived in Australia all my life, but coming from my spiritual tradition and my way of life of Islam, it is actually a slow-paced life. So everything is put in perspective. So for example, something really tiny. Wealth is not something that we seek after. We have your job, go ahead, but we're not going to kill ourselves over it. Why? Because rizq, which is your sustenance, not your wealth that you put in the bank, because we can die and that money is just going to go into inheritance, right? Rizq is what you need to survive, which is really not much, right? We believe it's already predestined. So what does that do? All of a sudden, all right, I don't have to worry about that. God says in the Quran, I will take care of you and I will take care of your children. Don't worry about that. You go do the job. Don't sit back on your watching TV all day. Go do. You have to do the work, but you don't have to bring the anxiety with it. And that's what modern society does. It brings the anxiety. I'm the provider. I'm the protector. I'm the sustainer. Where a Muslim mindset is, I'm not the protector, I'm not the provider, I'm not the sustainer. God is. But what I will do is I will go to my job and I'll do my very best. But I'm not going to work ridiculous hours. Why? Because what's important to me is my spouse and my children. In my case, I have a spouse and I have children. That is more important than upgrading my car and working another job to have all the comforts of this world, right? So my answer to that is that we need to challenge ourselves as a Western society. We've come to a collision on every level.
Yep.
Mental, emotional, physical, psychological, environmental. The answer is not going to be a 5-minute go walk without your earpods. I'm sorry. I believe we need a radical change. And COVID clearly didn't teach us that. 2 years being at home clearly didn't teach us that here in Melbourne. So I'm going to push back and say, what kind of radical change are we individually going to make that's going to be positive for ourselves and society at large? But having said that, can I just say something that what we discussed? I believe our society sets us up to fail. What do I mean by that? We have, for example, interest rates that are all-time high. Housing's incredibly expensive. Jobs are expensive. You can't find accommodation. So our society is not helping us. I can talk lovely talk like this, but in reality, just living in Melbourne, our society is not helping us to live a cohesive, slow-paced life. In Bhutan, they had, what was their, they called the happiness index.
Gross national happiness.
Yeah, we don't think about that here. That's not how we're measuring our successes in Australia. So maybe we just need to think about it. Sorry, the gentleman had his hand up.
Yeah, so this might be a good point to actually throw it open to questions because I'm sure there are plenty.
Can I just say one thing?
A brief response and then I'll take some questions,
You know, in primitive times, cave people, you know, they lived a fairly relaxed life. You might be surprised. The stress was around an immediate danger. So, you know, there might be a wild animal or something like that. But their cortisol levels, you know, were intermittent. And so in these days, we live with high cortisol adrenaline levels constantly. We don't even realise that. And so we've got no resilience when something comes along that, you know, genuinely we need to work with. And a lot of that is caused by the digital input. And I just wonder whether, you know, just for maybe 1 hour a day, put the mobile phone out of reach. You know, we're primed, we take it to bed with us. You know, we're waiting for the ping of emails and the SMSs. You know, we're so on this hyper alert. You know, we can't deal with anything. That's,
Yeah, it's changing our brain. That we know that. It's actually literally changing our brain.
Right.
Anyway, look, this has been really one of the best, I think, of these contemplation conversations that we've had because our panel has been so terrific and such an engaged audience. So thanks to our panellists, to Jess, to Sarah, to Sunam, and thanks to a wonderful audience and to the Contemplative Studies Centre. It's been wonderful being your host today, so thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.